Good morning, everyone. In the last session, we understood what is API gateway and what is the role of API gateway in microservices architecture, right? API gateway is acting as the entry point for microservices in our application. Any common logics like security, monitoring, timeouts, such kind of logics we are going to implement in the API gateway application. Mainly in the API gateway, we will be having filters plus routing. Filter is used to perform pre-processing and post-processing of a request. If you want to verify whether that request is valid or not, we can implement that logic by using filter. Once the filter execution is completed, we want to forward our request to particular backend service. For that, we are going to use routing concept. Okay, based on the URL pattern, with the help of the predicates, based on the URL pattern, we are routing the request to particular backend service available in the application. Okay, today we are going to understand another topic in the microservices, which is config server. Okay, first let's understand what we are doing in our applications. So if you take our data JPA application, there is a properties file is available. Within this properties file, we are configuring, within this properties file, we are configuring database information. In the real time, how our project will be executed. In the real time, our application will be available, nothing but source code will be available. This application we are going to package by using Maven. We are going to compile by using Java. We are developing our application with the help of Spring Boot. Application source code will be available. When we do the compilation, then bytecode will be generated. App source code will be available here. That app source code we are compiling, then our application bytecode will be generated. Once this bytecode is generated, we are going to package our application as a jar file. Every Spring Boot application can be packaged as a jar file. The reason, Spring Boot application execution will start from main method. Any application which is executing from the main method can be packaged as a jar file. Once we package our application as a jar file, then we are going to create Docker image for our application. Nowadays in the real time, every project will be packaged by using Docker. So we are going to create Docker image for our application. Once the Docker image is created, then we are going to deploy that Docker image in Kubernetes. Deploy in Kubernetes. This is real-time application deployment process. Nowadays, in every company, they are going to follow this architecture to deploy our applications. As a developer, we are developing source code for our application. Then we are going to compile that source code so that bytecode will be generated. Nothing but dot class files will be generated. Once bytecode is generated, we will do the Maven package. So if it is a normal Java web application, war file will be created. If it is a Spring Boot application, then jar file will be created. Once the jar file is created, we are going to create Docker image by using that jar file. So Docker software we are going to use for containerization purpose. To execute our application in any system, Docker is going to help us. Docker image we are going to create. That Docker image we are going to deploy in Kubernetes cluster. So here Docker is called containerization software. Kubernetes is called as orchestration software. Okay. Now here, if you observe in our application, there is a properties file is available, or there will be a YML file in our application. Currently, the database information we are configuring in the properties file. That properties file is available within the application. Properties file is available. That properties file is available within our Java application. That Java application packaged as a jar, then it is packaged as a Docker image, then we are deploying in the Kubernetes cluster. Now, YML file or properties file also available within the application only. Tomorrow, I want to connect to different database. My application is available. Currently, it is connecting to one database with a name called SBMS36. Tomorrow, I want to change the database, or some messages are available in the application. I want to change the messages. So if you change any message, or if you want to change any properties data, then you need to recompile your project, you need to repackage your project, you need to recreate a Docker image, you need to redeploy your application, then only the latest changes will be deployed. So this complete process is called build and deployment. Up to here, is called as a build process of the application. Compiling the source code, create a jar file, then create a Docker image. This process is called project build process. This process is called build process, and this is called deployment. So in order to run one application in the real time, build and deployment will be available. Currently, we are developers, we are developing the code in our IDE. When you are developing the code in the IDE, you can directly right click, run as boot application. This is local environment. But in the real time, multiple developers will be available. All the developers code will be available in the Git repository. DevOps team is responsible to take the code from the GitHub, compile that code, package that code, create a Docker image, then do the deployment of the application. This process is called build and deployment. This process is called build and deployment. So if you make any small change in the properties file or YML file, we need to re-perform the build and deployment of our application, which is a time-taking process. To avoid this problem, what we need to do in the real time? To avoid this problem, we need to separate the properties from our application. Currently, properties are available within the application properties file or within the application YML file. If you configure properties within the application, then project will be tightly coupled with the properties data. Tomorrow, if you make any changes to those properties, you need to perform build and deployment process again. In the real time, build and deployment process is a time-taking process. It is a time-taking process. So it is going to take a lot of time. For example, if I want to connect to 4 different databases in a day, then 4 times you need to perform the build and deployment process. So application is tightly coupled with the properties file. Here, this is not the recommended approach. To avoid this problem, what we are going to do is, whatever the properties that are required for our application, we are going to keep inside one Git repository. We are going to use one Git repository. Inside the Git repository, our properties files or our YML files will be available. For example, I am having a project called Welcome API. Then Welcome API.yml file will be available here. Similarly, there is a project called Greet API is available. For Greet API, whatever the configuration is required. Suppose if you are having 2 microservices, for every microservice, its own YML file will be available. Greet API is available. For the Greet API, YML file will be available. For the Welcome API, one YML file will be available. Where these YML files we are going to store? we are going to store these YML files in the Git repository. And here my actual microservices are available, which is welcome API, and another one is greet API is available. These are my actual microservices. Currently, I'm taking two microservices as an example. In the real time, 10 microservices, 20 microservices, 30 microservices also can be available. As of now, within the microservice, our YML file is available, which is making our application tightly coupled with the properties. Now, I want to make my application loosely coupled with the properties. So instead of keeping YML file inside the project, we are going to keep the YML file outside of the project, that we are going to keep in the GitHub repository. Now, how my application will load the YML data from the GitHub repository? To load that YML data from the GitHub repository, there will be one more server as a mediator. That server is called as config server. So in the microservices, we are going to use config server. This GitHub repository will be loaded by config server. Our microservices are going to load the data by using this config server. Now, my application directly dealing with the YML files, my application not dealing with the YML files. Is my application dealing with the YML file? My application not dealing with the YML file? My application not dealing with the YML file. Where the YML files available? YML files are available in the GitHub repository. Who is responsible to load those YML files? Our config server is responsible to load the YML files. Our applications will get the data from the config server, not from the YML directly. So now in the microservices, currently people are using config server to deal with properties in our application. So as of now, in the application properties file or YML file is there. In that we are configuring all the properties. What is the problem? If I configure the properties within the application, if any change required, you need to perform build and deployment process again. But here, what is the benefit? My application is loosely coupled with the YML files. Tomorrow, if any change is required in the properties, do I need to rebuild and deploy my application? Just I need to restart the config server. Just we need to restart the config server, which is very easy and less time taking process. So that's why in the bar projects, people are using config server. You understand the concept? What is the purpose of config server? It is used to separate application and application properties. Now, see the difference here. What is cloud config server? We are configuring our application config properties in properties file or YML file. What kind of properties will be available? Database properties will be available. SMTP properties will be available. Kafka properties, some messages also will be available. In the yesterday JRTP class also we have seen messages we are configuring in the YML. Application messages will be available. Database properties will be available. SMTP properties will be available. Application properties are YML files will be packaged along with our application. So here, when we are going to create jar file for the project, that YML file or properties file will be part of our jar file. It will be available inside the jar file. If we want to make any changes to the properties, then we have to repackage our application. That means we need to recreate the jar file for our application and we have to redeploy our application. If any changes required in the config properties, we need to repeat the complete project build and deployment, which is time consuming process. What is build and deployment process? Compile the project again, package the project as a jar file, create a Docker image for the application and deploy the project in the cluster. That is the complete build and deployment process. If any small change happened in the properties file, we need to repeat the entire build and deployment process, which is time taking. What we are going to do now to avoid this problem, we have to separate our project and config properties files. Okay, as of now, within the application, the properties file and YML file is available. If any small change is required, we need to repeat the build and deployment process, which is time taking. So how to avoid this problem? To avoid this problem, the solution is we need to separate configuration properties from our application. How do we separate that configuration properties from our application? By using config server. To externalize config properties from the application, we can use config server concept. Are you able to understand? Tell me, what is a config server in the microservices? What is config server in the microservices? Config server is used to externalize config properties from the application. Okay, so to externalize configuration properties from the application, we are going to use config server concept. Cloud config server is part of Spring Cloud library. So if you want to work with the config server, then we are going to use Spring Cloud config server concept. Application property files we will maintain in the Git repo. Config server will load them, will give to our application. Okay, so as we have seen in the diagram, whatever the properties files are required for our application, they will be available in the Git repository. These files will be loaded by our config server. Our applications will get the data from the config server. Here, the point that we need to remember, in the Git repository, multiple YML files will be available. For every project, one YML file will be available. Here, multiple microservices will be available. Then, how config server will understand which file is belongs to which application? In the Git repository, we are going to keep for every microservice, one YML file will be available. So assume that there are 10 YML files available. There are 10 microservices available. Which file data should be given to which microservice? There is a small line here, that is whatever the name you configure for your application, with that name you need to create the YML. Based on your application name, config server will understand which YML file data should be given to that application. Are you able to understand? Based on the application name, it will understand from which YML file it has to load the data. Okay, our microservices will get the config properties from config server, and the config server will load them from GitHub repository. So this is theoretical points. Could you please read them once again? What is config server? I have explained in two diagrams. So this is complete build and deployment process tightly coupled. So if you make any small change, you need to repeat this build and deployment process. To make it simple, to avoid the tightly coupling, we are going to externalize configuration properties from the application. For that, we are going to use a GitHub repository. Our YML files will be available in the GitHub repository. Config server is responsible to load the files from the GitHub repository. Our microservices will get the properties from the config server. How config server will understand for which application, which file data should be given? Based on the name. Application name should match with the YML file name. Based on that, it will provide the data. Could you please read these points now? Come on, just 2 minutes. Just read that. We are configuring our application config properties in the properties file or YML file. What type of properties we are going to configure? Database, nothing but data source, SMTP, Kafka, messages, Redis, security, and number of properties will be available. Now, here, where that properties file or YML file will be available? Properties file or YML file will be available within the application. So when we create a jar file for the project, that file also will be part of the jar file. If we want to make any changes to that properties file, then what we need to do? We need to repackage our application and we need to redeploy our application. Okay, what is the problem with the build and deployment process? Time taking, compile, jar file, docker image, deploy in the cluster. So it is a time taking process. So how to avoid this time taking process? To avoid this time taking process, we need to separate our project source code and project config properties files. Project source code, project config properties file. To externalize config properties from the application, what is the solution for us? Cloud config server. Where is that cloud config server is available? Cloud config server is part of Spring Cloud library. It is part of Spring Cloud library. Okay. Now, could you please read these things? Application config property files we will maintain in the GitHub repository. Config server will load them and will give to our application based on application name. Our microservices will get config properties from the config server. Config server will get those from the GitHub repository. Okay, so now here, what is the procedure we need to do? We need to have one GitHub repository. In that GitHub repository, our YML files should be available. And we should have one config server application which is responsible to load from the GitHub. And we need to create our microservices which are responsible to get the data from the config server. Are you guys clear? Total 3 steps here. One is GitHub repository. Second one is config server project. Third one is client applications for the config server. Actual microservices which will get the data from the config server. Okay, now see the procedure for development. Anybody tried this? I gave these notes yesterday itself. How to work with cloud config server. Did anybody try implementing this one? No. Okay. Develop config server application. Okay. Create a Git repository and keep YML files required for the projects. I'm going to create 2 microservices. One is welcome API. Another one is greet API. So what I will do is in the GitHub repository, I will keep 2 files, greet.yml, welcome.yml. Greet.yml is required for greet application. Welcome.yml is required for welcome application. I am already having that GitHub repository, guys. Let me go to that GitHub repository, configuration properties. My Git repository is available. What is the name? Greet.yml. What is the name? Welcome.yml. What is the meaning of that? In my microservices, application name I need to configure with the same name. Spring.application.name is equal to greet. Spring.application.name is equal to welcome. Go to this greet.yml. Message is available. Message is a key and value. Good morning is available. Then go to welcome.yml. Key message is available. Value welcome to Ashok IT is available. So there are 2 YML files available. I just kept one key value pair. You can configure database properties. You can configure application messages. Whatever the data that is required for your application, you can configure that data here. Whatever the data that is required, you can configure that data here. Good. Now, so our GitHub repository is ready, guys. Our GitHub repository is ready. First step, create GitHub repository and keep YML files required for the projects. We should keep file name as a application name. My app name is greet, then file name should be greet.yml. If the app name is welcome, then file name should be welcome.yml. In each file, I have one entry, key value. Key is a message and values are different. Good. Then what is the second step? Create Spring Starter application with a dependency. What is that dependency? Spring Cloud config server. So we need to create one config server application. What is the role of this config server application? What is the role of this config server application? It is responsible to load the data from the GitHub repository based on the application name. Okay, let's go here and create config server application, file, new, Spring Starter project. My project name is config server application. Click on next. What is the dependency that we need to add for the config server, guys? Cloud config server dependency. Check for that. Yeah. So what are the dependencies available? Config server dependency, config client dependency. So when to use a config server dependency, when to use a config client dependency? When you are creating config server application, config server dependency. When we are creating microservices, then config client dependency. So currently I'm selecting only config server. Can you read this one? Central management for the configuration via Git SVN or HashiCorp Vault. Okay, so we are using Git as a central repository to manage our YML files. Good. Click on next and click on finish. So with this, our config server project is getting created. Let's go to its pom.xml and verify the dependency that we selected. Config server project is created. Spring Cloud version it is using. What is the dependency we are getting? Spring Cloud config server dependency. To represent that this application is a config server application, we need to enable one annotation. We need to write one annotation which is enable config server. Okay. What is the annotation we are writing? Enable config server. What is the meaning of enable config server? We have seen enable discovery client, enable admin server. Now we are using enable config server. What is the meaning of enable config server? What is the meaning of enable config server? This project is acting as a config server application. What is the role of config server in our project now? Responsible to get the data from the GitHub repository. Why we need to get the data from GitHub repository? Why we are not configuring within application? To make our application loosely coupled with the properties. Okay. So first step is creating a project. First step is creating a GitHub repository. You can use my GitHub repository also. It is a public repository only. If you want, you can create one GitHub repository. In that GitHub repository, you need to keep your YML files. Then create our boot application. When we are creating the boot application, we need to select this dependency, which is cloud config server dependency. Then what is the third step? Write enable config server annotation at the boot start class. Why we need to write this annotation at the boot start class? To represent that it is a config server application. Then what is the next point here? Configure the below properties in the YML. That means this config server application should know in which Git repository our YML files are available. Okay. To represent that in which Git repository our YML files available, we are going to specify Spring Cloud config server Git URI clone on start is equal to true. Nothing but whenever this config server project is started, immediately it has to clone this GitHub repository. Clone on start to true. Nothing but whenever this config server project is started, immediately I have to clone that GitHub repository. We need to establish the link between config server and GitHub repository. So our GitHub repository URL we are giving in the config server project YML file, so that when the config server is started, it will get the data from the YMLs. It is going to download the YML files which are available in our GitHub repository. Now go to our config server project, resources, change this properties file to YML file. Change it to YML. Inside this YML, let us configure this. Management security enabled. Do we have any security for this application? No, let's leave it for now. Spring Cloud config server git URI clone on start is equal to true. Then next one, here we have configured one more thing, management dot security dot enabled. No, that feature is removed, not working. Leave it. Spring Cloud config server git URI clone and start. This is my GitHub repository where the YML is available. Clone and start. True. That means whenever this project is started, you clone that GitHub repository. That's it. So with this, our config server project is ready. Let's do Maven update. We change it that properties file to YML file. Then let's perform Maven update on the project. Refresh. Now, so here server port number. By default, it is using 8080. I want to change that port number. How do we do that? Server.port 9090 because Oracle is installed in my system. So I'm taking the port number as 9090. Let's do Maven update. Refresh. Maven update. Completed. Let us run this application. Run as boot app. I'm starting my config server application. Yes, it started embedded server Tomcat. Then it is using the port number as 9090. So with this, we are able to run our config server application. So any confusion in developing the config server project? Any confusion in developing the config server project? Just read these points, guys. What is the first step? What is the first step? Come on. Create GitHub repository and keep YML files required for our project. So I have 2 microservices. That's why I'm taking 2 YML files. Okay. Then what is the next step? Second step. What is the second step? Create Spring Starter application with below dependency. Cloud config server dependency we have used. Then next one, enable config server annotation at the boot start class. Then what is this configuration? We are telling in which Git repository our microservices YML files are available. That's it. We are able to start the config server project. What is the next step now? Developing our microservices. Now, can I say our microservices are going to act as a client for config server? Can we say it is a client for the config server? Yes. What is the procedure to develop our config server client application? What is the dependency we are using? Config client. I will create one REST API. Inside the REST API, I want to get a message. Actually, this message available in a YML. Where is that YML available? That YML is available in the config server. Now, my application will load the data from the YML directly? No. What my application should do now? My application should load the data from the config server. Config server will load the data from the YML available in the Git repository. Good. So let us develop configure client application. Can you please read these steps to develop a client? Developing one client is the same for developing 100 clients also. If you know how to develop one client to get the data from the config server, same process we will repeat for other clients also. Nothing but other microservices which are available in the project. Good. Come on. Can you read this? Create boot application with the below dependencies. Web starter to create a REST controller. Configure client to get the data from the config server. Dev tools to restart the service. Then Create one REST controller with required methods. I'm creating a REST controller, get welcome message. What it is returning? Message. But actually, where is that message? That is I declared it as a variable at the rate value of key. So at the rate value annotation to load the data from the YML. If you have single property in the YML file, you can load it by using at the rate value annotation. If you have 10 properties, yesterday we have seen how to load them into Java class. If you want to load multiple entries, properties class we will create. If you want to load a single entry, then we will go for at the rate value annotation. Then here we need to represent our application is a client for the config server. How do we represent our application is a client for the config server? By using this URL optional.config server. This is where my config server is running. This property will represent that this application is acting as a config server client application. Application name, what I am configuring here, YML I am configuring. What application name I am configuring as a welcome. So what is the meaning of the welcome? It should get the data from the welcome.yml. Read the steps again. Server development is completed. GitHub repository available. Config server is also available. Now we need to develop config client. Config client nothing but our microservice we need to develop. See here how we are going to develop this. Read these points. Come on. Create Spring Boot application with below dependencies. Create Spring Boot application with below dependencies. Web starter, config client, dev tools. Creating a REST controller. Then configuring config server URL in our microservice. Then run the application and test this application. Come on. Let's go to here. Create one config client application. New Spring Starter project. Config client application. Click on next. What is the dependency, guys? Web starter, dev tools. What is the dependency? Config server or config client? Client. Click on next. Finish. Go to its pom.xml. Spring Cloud version is available. Web starter. Why we need web starter? To create a REST controller. Then what is this dependency? Cloud starter config dependency. Client dependency we have added. Dev tools and a test dependency is available. That's it. Let us create one REST controller here. New class some message REST controller. Message REST controller is available. Represent this as a REST controller by using @REST controller annotation. Then I'm writing one method, public string get a message method. Public string get message method. Okay. Here I'm declaring this as a variable, private string message, return message. I'm not hard coding the message. From where this message should come? In the YML file. In the YML file, key value is available, right? Key is message, value is available. Let us map it to one URL pattern @getMapping/. @getMapping/. So currently, if I access this method, what it is going to return? Null value. Message variable just declared. Instance variable, it is not initialized. For instance variables, memory will be allocated at the time of object creation. Now what I want to do is, I want to load the message from GitHub repository YML file. Okay. Here greet.yml file is available. this is the message available. Can I say this is a key and this is a value? Now I know the key name. I know the key name. That key I want to load into my variable. That key value I want to load into my variable. So to load that YML file data, single entry is available there. If you have multiple entries, properties class will be created. But we have single entry here. When we have the single entry, there will be a annotation called @value annotation. What is the key available? Message is the key available. What is the meaning of this @value annotation here? What is the meaning of @value? Identify the key in the YML. Identify the key in the YML as a message. Get the value which is available for that key. But here there are two YMLs available. In both YMLs, same key is available. So from which YML it has to get that key? From which YML it has to get that key? Based on the application name. Now go to our client application YML file. Convert this application.yml. Here I will configure server.port. I will configure server.port as 9091. Then next one, spring.application.name. If I configure this name as welcome, what is the meaning? What is the meaning now? It should get the message value from the welcome.yml. As we discussed, application name should be same as a file name. So that point already we have discussed here. If you see, we should keep file name as application name. What is the application name I am keeping now? Welcome. What is the meaning of that? It is a welcome microservice. From which YML? From the in the Git repository, greet YML available, welcome YML available, welcome.yml. File name should match with my application name. Then this application will get the data from the welcome.yml file. Okay, but so this we created a client application. We created a REST controller. In the REST controller, we have a method. Method is returning some message text. But from where that message text is getting coming? Based on this key. Where is this key available? In the welcome.yml as well as in the greet.yml. Which YML message key value will be stored to this variable? Based on the application name. Along with this, we need to tell where is our config server is available. Okay, so we need to specify spring.config.import spring.config.import. For the config import, we need to specify where our config server is running. Where our config server is running? This config server is running in the localhost 9090. Config server will be running on the port number 9090. Config client is running on the port number 9091. This config client will get the data from the config server based on the name of the application. Are you guys able to understand this? So GitHub repository is available. In that GitHub repository, our YML files are available. We created a config server project. In the config server project, we have given GitHub repository URL. Now we created a config client application. For a client application, I have configured the name. That a name should match with my YML file name. And in the client application, I have configured where is my config server. My config server is running on the port number 9090. Okay, with this we are done with config server project creation, config client creation also. Can we run this application and can we see really is it loading the data from the YML from the config server? Clear? Run this. Config server is already running. Let's go for config client. refresh, do the Maven update. Run as boot application. Config client application we have started. What is this line? What is this line? Fetching config from server at 9090. That means client is able to connect with the config server or not. Client is able to connect with the config server. Good. Clear this. Go to browser. Make a request. Now, which YML file data we will get into our variable? Welcome.yml. Why welcome.yml file data will come into our variable? Application name we configured as, if I configure as a greet YML data we are going to get. Check this one. Localhost : client port number is 9091. We are getting the message as welcome to Ashok IT. Actually, where is that message? In the Git repository. From the Git repository, it loaded by config server. From the config server, our application loaded that value. Now, let me stop this and let me change the name to greet now. Let me change the name to greet now. Run this project. Excuse me. Application started. Okay. Refresh. What is happening now? Good morning. So how it is getting the data from the YML? Based on the application. If application name and file names are different, if application name and file names are different, is it possible? It is not possible. If application name and YML names are different, then it is not possible. Good. So with this, we are able to understand what is cloud config server in the microservices. What is cloud config server in the microservices? So can you tell me what is the main purpose of config server? What is the main purpose of config server in the Spring Boot? Which is used to externalize config properties of our application. So what is the benefit we are getting now? Tomorrow, when the messages are changed, do I need to redeploy our microservices? We just need to restart our config server. Rebuild, redeploy is not required. If there is any change in the YML file, we just need to restart our config server project. Got it? So in the interview, they will ask this question. How do you manage configuration properties in your application? How do you manage configuration properties in your application? How do we manage them? We will manage our configuration properties by using config server. Why we will use a config server? We want to separate our application code and application properties. Application properties will be maintained in the Git repository. From that Git repository, config server application is going to load the data. From the config server, our microservices will load the data. Now, my application is loosely coupled with the configuration properties. So to externalize configuration properties from the application, we are using cloud config server concept. Are you guys clear with this one? Any questions, anybody? Now I created one microservice. Suppose if I have 20 microservices, every microservice will have its own name. Every microservice will have its own YML file. That's it. Whenever our client application is started, it will connect with the config server. How client will know that where is config server? How client will know that where is the config server? We are only telling that the URL of the config server. How config server will know where is our YML file? Based on the Git repository URL we are giving. For in the Git repository we are keeping our YML files. That Git repository URL we are giving to config server. config server URL we are giving to our client application. So now our microservices will act as client for config server. How we are acting as a client for Eureka, admin, Zipkin. Now our microservices will act as a client for config server also. Are you guys got the clarity? Good. Online students, for every for every Akash, your question is wrong. For every microservice, individual config client need to be created. Every microservice is acting as a config client. You no need to create a separate client. So if you have hotels API, hotels API is one microservice which will act as a client for the config server. We have caps API. Caps API is one microservice which will act as a config client. Every microservice you are developing will act as a client for the config server. That's it. Perfect. Now look at this diagram. Microservices architecture. Eureka server, which is acting as a discovery server, or we can say it is a service registry. Admin server is available, which is used for monitoring and managing all the APIs at one place. Zipkin server is available, which is used for distributed tracing. Then here, Greet API is available, Welcome API is available. For the Welcome API, more than one instance is available for the load balancing. Okay, with the help of the load balancing, requests will be distributed. And in the Greet API, PN client is available. What is the role of the PN client? PN client is going to communicate with the service registry to get the URLs, and it will communicate with the welcome API. Inter-service communication is available. Then after, API gateway is available. API gateway is an entry point for all the backend microservices in our application. Any cross-cutting logics like security, filters, monitoring, like timeouts handling, such kind of common logics which are required for all the microservices, we can keep in the API gateway. In the API gateway, filter will be available. Predicates we will use to do the routing in the API gateway. So API gateway is a mediator between incoming request and backend services. When the request comes to API gateway, it will validate that request and it will take a decision for the routing. Okay, then next one, config server is available. Config server is used to externalize configuration properties of our application. Instead of keeping our properties within the application, we want to separate them for the loosely coupling so that project maintenance will become easy. So to separate configuration properties from our application, we are using config server concept. In the GitHub repository, our YML files will be available. Those YML files will be loaded by config server application. From the config server, our microservices will load the data based on the key. If you know the key name, then you can get the value. To load that key data, to load the value based on the key, we used @value annotation. What is the meaning of @value annotation here? What is the purpose of this @value? Go to that particular YML and identify the key whose name is message. If that key is present, get the value of that key and inject into this variable. Basically, this we can say field injection. We are injecting the value to the variable. Where is that value? Where is that value? In the YML. So can I say we are performing field injection, getting the value from the YML, storing into our variable with the help of @value annotation. If that key is not available, null value will be injected. If a key is available, get the value for that key and store that value into our variable. So once it is stored into our variable, when you access this method, we are returning this variable. What is the meaning of returning the variable? Whatever the value available in the variable, that value it will return. From where that value is coming? From the message key. Where that message key available? In the greet YML, in the welcome YML. From which YML it will get that value? It depends on the name that you configure. If your application name is greet, it will get it from the greet YML. If your application name is welcome, it will get it from the welcome.yml. Are you guys clear with this one? Good. Fine. Any questions, anyone? Sorry? Spring Cloud config server. If you are using pure Spring Boot with microservices, cloud config server concept will be used. Even in our project, we are using these config servers. What if config server goes down? If a config server goes down, you can't load those properties. So in the real time, applications should not go down. They will use high-end systems to run our applications. It's not like config server will go down. Restart and deployment means the same. No. How profiling concept will work with the config server? Good question. If you are using profiles concept, right? For every YML, welcome.yml is available. Welcome underscore dev.yml, welcome underscore sit.yml, welcome underscore prod.yml. For this application, multiple profiles can be created. Then what you need to do in this application YML, you need to enable the profile. How do we enable the profile? Spring dot profiles dot active. So profiles dot active, if you specify dev, sorry, not here. Go to config server client YML. Here application name is configured. Suppose my project is having profiles concept. Then what we will do? Spring dot profiles dot active. So active profile, suppose if I keep it as a dev, then what is the meaning of that? What is the meaning of that? Which YML it has to load now? Welcome. From the welcome, which profile data should be loaded now? Dev. That means it will check for welcome underscore dev.yml. It will check for welcome underscore dev.yml. Suppose if here currently how many YMLs available for one microservice? Only one YML. If you want to configure profiles concept, then what you need to do? Welcome underscore dev.yml, welcome sit.yml, welcome uat.yml, welcome prod.yml. When multiple YMLs available for the single service, those are called profiles of our application. So which profile you activate, based on that profile, it will get the data from that particular YML. How can we change the value of a particular key? Changing the value of the key means you need to change the YML, you need to commit to the Git repository. The YML files available in the Git repository. If you want to make any change to YML, what is the procedure? We know how to work with the Git commits, right? Change YML file will be there in your local. You will do that change, then you will commit to the Git repository. Then you need to restart your config server applications. We separated YML file for our application. These things we need to, you can remove. This port number where we can configure, guys. Where we can configure this port number. In the Git repository YML. You no need to configure this YML. Profile activation, all these things you no need to configure. In our microservice YML, what will be available? Only application name, config server URL will be available. This port configuration also you can do in the welcome.yml, which is available in the Git repository. In our application YML, only application name and config server URL will be available. Remaining everything we will configure in the actual YML, which is available in the GitHub repository. Good. What we have to do to access changed properties in the GitHub dynamically without restart of the config server. Without restarting, it is not going to load. We have to restart that config server. And let me check, is there any possibility is available to load that dynamically without restarting the config server? I'm not aware of that. I need to check it. How to access secured GitHub config server? In the real time, guys, secured GitHub repository is nothing but VPN access will be available. Outside people cannot access. For your company, VPN will be available. Once you connect to the VPN, then only you can access GitHub repositories. Network team is going to take care of that. Who can access our GitHub repository, who cannot access. Once you joined in the project, they will give you VPN access. If you connect to the VPN, then only you can access company repository. Otherwise, you cannot access company repositories. Fine. Good. Any questions, anyone? Offline students? Any questions, anyone? No. Good. So fine. With this, we are done for today. Please do the practice of this config server before coming to tomorrow's session. Tomorrow, we will talk about either Redis cache or circuit breaker, some microservices topics we are going to discuss. Thank you, guys. Online students, any questions, anyone? You can unmute and you can ask me.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Yeah, here the application name means which we are giving in the YML file, not
Correct.
the game which we like while creating. We are giving that name.
Not that name. In the YML, whatever the spring.application.name property you are configuring, whatever the name you are giving there, with that name you need to do that YML file creation.
Okay, sir.
Not the project name. Application name means which you are configuring in the YML file.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Hello, Ashok sir.
Yes.
Sir, Spring AOP notes are there or no?
I don't think so, sir. Let me check it once.
Because lecture is there on YouTube, but
notes I will check it, sir, once.
Okay, you said that it will be available on Telegram group, but I have checked yesterday, but I couldn't find out it.
Sure, sir. I will see that once.
Okay, sir.
Hi, Ashok. Good morning. In today's session, you have explained to load a single valued map through the @value annotation. How can we load the values like if the map contains multiple key values?
Yes, sir. Are you part of JRTP batch?
No, Ashok. I'm only.
Maybe yesterday I explained that. I will discuss that also.
Sure. Thank you.
Sir, database properties you mentioned in the
data source man, URL, username, password.
Yes, sir. That also we can configure it in the configuration repository, right?
Correct.
But when starting the client, suppose client microservice, these properties will generally read it from our application properties, right?
Now so it will load it from the config server.
Okay, when our application starts itself, it can connect to the.
It will load from the config server. I have shown you message also. In the third line, it printed config is fetched from the config server. At the time of application startup only, it will get from the config server. Earlier, it will be available in our application YML. Now, when our application started, immediately it will fetch from the config server.
So that is when you send the request.
No, not in this time of request.
Okay.
Yeah, when the application started.
Okay, let me try this, sir. Maybe properties I will configure in the configuration.
Yeah, connect with the database by using that. You can try this.
Okay.
And guys, you can try one thing. You can configure data source properties in the GitHub YML and you see whether your application is connecting with the database or not. You can try that once. Because when the client application is started, immediately it will fetch the data from the config server. So for verification, you can use one database operation in your microservice. Database configuration, DB properties you configure in the GitHub YML and check it. Is it loading the DB properties at the time of application startup or not? We can validate that.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, we have YML in application and I have YML in a config server. Git repository. Okay.
Correct.
So application
if the keys are same, right, it will override. Keys should be different.
Oh, no. Application giving the preference to which one?
First,
to
our
application
YML will be loaded because in our YML only config server URL will be available. Na? First, it should know
Yes,
where
yes.
is the config server.
Okay, sir.
Yeah, first our YML will be loaded. From our YML, it will understand where is the config server. Then it will fetch that from the config server.
Sir, in the
Hi.
Git repository YML file, it will follow the YML syntax or normal text file?
YML syntax, it's a YML file. YML syntax you need to follow. The extension is .yml. Na? You need to follow YML syntax only. Why you will write as a text?
In the Git repository YML file.
Yeah, wherever, sir, whether it is in the project or whether it is in the Git repository, YML means YML syntax we have to follow.
Okay, sir. Thank
Hello,
you.
sir.
Yes.
So, if you modify anything in YML, so
Hmm.
config server is restarted. So how
Yes.
the client application get update
Client
that?
application will fetch that data, sir, from the config server.
So every
Refresh.
time for every request,
Automatic
you need
reload
to-
will be there for that.
Mhm.
Ashok, in API gateway, right? You're telling that routing concept. So
Yes.
one controller contains the multiple endpoints. So how
URL
we
pattern method URL patterns should be different.
that means how can we separate that to multiple URLs
No,
by
no.
separating
When you are configuring the path, na comma separated paths you can give. In the
that's what
yesterday
I'm asking.
documentation.
In array wise, you need to give and comma.
Yeah.
That's what I'm questioning. I'm asking.
Right. /welcome /welcome1 /welcome2. All
Comma.
these URLs should be routed to welcome API. In the
So-
path, we configured one URL pattern. Na, you can give comma separated.
Okay. Thanks, Ashok. Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
Yeah.
And config client YML file, can you please open?
Sorry.
Config client that YML file. You configure that config server URLs, right?
Yeah. This is the YML of the client.
No, this is okay. Client. Actually, below that, right? Spring below config is not coming. Cloud config is coming for me.
You can use that. No problem. Anything which is
Not
coming, you
issue,
can
right?
use that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Sir, how we can create a YML file and clone commit it to Git repository?
You should have Git idea, sir. If you know GitHub, then you can do it. Or else you can use my Git repository.
No, sir. How can we create that only YML file?
Normal YML you can create now. How do you create a text file? In the same way, you can create a YML file.
Okay, sir.
Yeah.
Hello,
Fine.
sir. Config server is only applicable for the YML or it also applicable
Properties
for the
also you can do it.
Okay, so in that case, let's say in my project there are multiple properties files. So for example, for HTTP code, I just keep the separate file for the coding standard. Okay.
If you give separate files, Spring Boot will not understand that, sir. Spring Boot is having a standard. Your file should be application or properties. Multiple files, if you want to create, that comes under the profiles concept. You can't do like this db.properties, smtp.properties, kafka.properties. If you create, Spring Boot will not load them.
Okay, it means it won't be applicable on the client server.
Right. Right.
The application configurations. Okay. Okay, thank you.
Good. Fine, guys. With this, I'm stopping for today. We'll meet in the tomorrow session. Thank you.